Hello, Sleepyheads, and welcome back to Yawn and Learn, the channel where your curiosity curls up under a warm blanket and history gently tucks you in. I'm your host, Simone, your bedtime historian, storyteller, and tonight, your guide through the shadows. So, before you drift off, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine for no reason? Heard a creak in the dark and thought, what if it's something not quite alive? Humans have always been afraid of what waits in the dark, but we've also been obsessed with it. Because deep down, we don't just fear death, we fear what comes after. And that's where vampires come in. Long before Hollywood gave them perfect cheekbones and tragic love stories, vampires were something else entirely. Bloated corpses, wandering spirits, and blood-hungry reminders that the line between life and death was dangerously thin. Tonight, we're not hunting for monsters in movies. We're tracing the real history of the undead, from ancient graves and medieval nightmares to candlelit castles and silver screens. So fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and prepare to sink your teeth into the truth behind one of humanity's oldest obsessions: blood burials and the fear of the dead. Before vampires were pale, poetic lovers in castles, they were much messier. The first undead weren't charming immortals in velvet. They were swollen, ruddy corpses that villagers truly believed could crawl out of graves. In ancient Mesopotamia, people feared a spirit called the utuku, a restless ghost that slipped back into the world of the living to feed on vitality. Some texts even mention the ekimu, a dead person denied proper burial, doomed to wander, whispering, and draining life from the living through nightmares. Meanwhile, in early Hebrew and Babylonian myths, there was Lilith, a night demon who preyed upon infants and men, blamed for nocturnal visitations. Her legend would echo for centuries, inspiring the idea that not all hunger ends with death. The Greeks feared Lamia, a queen cursed by the gods to devour children and wander sleepless forever. The Romans had Strix, a shrieking bird woman that drank blood. In China, the Jiangshi, or hopping vampire, was said to drain life energy from travelers who dared sleep outdoors. Different continents, different centuries, same nightmare. A dead body that refuses to stay dead. Ancient communities treated corpses with almost paranoid caution. Bodies were buried with stones pressed over their mouths or stakes pinned through their chests, not because anyone liked the decor, but to stop them from coming back. In some Slavic graves, archaeologists have found skeletons with scythes placed across the necks, a just-in-case measure in case the head decided to wander off on its own. To us, it sounds like superstition. To them, it was insurance. Because if crops failed, or livestock died, or someone wasted away in the night, they didn't see disease. They saw a neighbor who refused to rest. Blood wasn't just a metaphor. It was proof of life itself. And if something drained it, something alive, or half alive, had to be responsible. So before the vampire became an aristocrat of the night, it was the villagers' worst suspicion, the whisper behind every illness, the reason every burial included one last anxious glance over the shoulder. The medieval plague and the birth of the vampire panic. If ancient myths gave us the idea of the undead, the Middle Ages gave us the panic. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, it killed over a third of the continent and left the survivors desperate for answers. Medicine had no explanation. Priests could only offer prayers, and when you can't explain death, you start looking for someone or something to blame. Villagers began to dig up graves. They said the dead were rising again, spreading sickness, feeding on the living. And what they found seemed to prove it. Some corpses looked fresh, their skin pink, their mouths wet with blood. Some were bloated, their nails long, their hair grown. People whispered, "They've been feeding." Of course, we know now that decomposition gases cause those changes, that blood seeps naturally, that skin pulls tight. But in a time before anatomy, the body's own decay looked like resurrection. One chronicle from 1672 in Serbia told of a man named Petar Blagojevic, who supposedly returned from the grave and demanded food from his neighbors until they exhumed him, found his body undecayed, and drove a stake through his heart. Reports like these spread through Eastern Europe like wildfire, especially in places like Transylvania, Moravia, and Poland. These investigations followed a pattern: a mysterious death, a rumor of a restless spirit, grave digging, staking, relief. The villagers didn't need proof, they needed control. The church soon got involved, trying to calm the hysteria, while also quietly agreeing that yes, demons could reanimate corpses. Because why waste a good sermon? Priests held midnight rituals to purify cemeteries. Wooden stakes and holy water became the medieval equivalent of public health measures. It was the birth of the vampire panic, a collision of fear, faith, and very bad forensics. But what made this panic spread wasn't just disease, it was storytelling. Each village's rumor became another's evidence. A priest's letter became a pamphlet became scripture, and before long, the vampire wasn't just a monster. It was a warning. Sin invites darkness, and death might not mean rest. So the next time someone tells you vampires aren't real, remind them that for centuries, entire villages lost sleep trying to prove otherwise. Faith, superstition, and the church. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that wherever there's fear, someone will learn to profit from it, or preach about it. By the late Middle Ages, the church began to notice something. People weren't just turning to priests for protection anymore, they were turning to stakes. Vampire stories were spreading faster than sermons, and the church wasn't about to let peasants fight spiritual battles without its approval. So, what did they do? They baptized the vampire. Clergy reframed these creatures not as local legends, but as evidence of sin. If the dead were rising, it wasn't random. It was punishment, a sign that God's order had been disturbed. And conveniently, the only cure was obedience. Holy water replaced garlic. Exorcisms replaced folklore. And suddenly, the vampire wasn't just a threat to your body, it was a threat to your soul. Church art began showing corpses crawling from graves, angels and demons fighting for the newly dead. Monks recorded miraculous accounts of spirits leaving coffins and begging for forgiveness. In a way, vampirism became the medieval PR campaign for repentance. But it went further than fear. By defining who was pure and who was corrupted, the church gained moral control. Witchcraft, heresy, vampirism, all became tangled together under one terrifying umbrella: the war between light and darkness. And if your crops failed or your neighbor looked pale, well, better call the priest before he starts glowing in the moonlight. It was a genius system. The vampire no longer belonged to folklore. It belonged to theology. A creature not just of the night, but of the soul's shadow. Enlightenment, science and the rationalization of the undead. By the 18th century, Europe was entering the age of reason. But reason, it turned out, wasn't always enough to kill a good story. The printing press had given birth to newspapers, and newspapers loved one thing above all else: panic that sells. Headlines screamed of blood-drained corpses, entire villages terrorized, and mysterious figures stalking the night. And now, for the first time, these weren't just whispers in a tavern. They were documented phenomena. Enter the scientists. doctors and anatomists began investigating vampire cases with scalpels instead of stakes. They exhumed bodies, recorded their findings, and accidentally made everything worse. Austrian military surgeon Johannes Fluckinger famously examined several supposed vampires in 1732 in Serbia. He published a report describing fresh corpses with new blood in the lungs and heart, and how locals had neutralized them by staking and burning. It was meant as a medical account, but readers took it as confirmation. After all, it was written by a doctor. These reports spread across Europe, picked up by philosophers, skeptics, and clergy alike. Voltaire mocked the obsession. What, vampires in Poland while we reason in Paris? But ridicule couldn't erase fascination. Even the London Journal covered the panic, introducing the word vampire into English print for the very first time. Ironically, the Enlightenment, the era of logic, anatomy, and science, was the same era that cemented the vampire as a cultural icon, because when science dissected fear, fear evolved. The vampire was no longer a bloated peasant haunting a graveyard. It was an idea, an allegory for what happens when reason fails to calm imagination. And imagination always wins. From folklore to fiction, the birth of the romantic vampire. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the vampire had finally escaped the graveyard and walked straight into literature. What began as a superstition in the Balkans became a fascination in the salons of London and Paris. The Enlightenment had stripped away the magic from the world, and so, naturally, people invented new myths to replace it. Only this time, they didn't come from fear of death. They came from fear of desire. The vampire became elegant, charismatic, dangerous in a new way. It started in 1819 with John Polidori's The Vampire, written during the same stormy summer that also gave us Frankenstein. Polidori's vampire wasn't a rotting peasant. He was a nobleman, cold, handsome, manipulative. A monster in a tuxedo. The kind of predator that smiled before it killed you. Readers were hooked. For the first time, the vampire wasn't just a corpse. It was a metaphor. It represented power, temptation, lust, and class. The upper crust feeding, quite literally, on the poor. By the time Bram Stoker's Dracula arrived in 1897, the myth had evolved into a full-blown cultural obsession. Dracula wasn't just a monster. He was an invasion. A foreign noble corrupting English purity, a symbol of disease, immigration, and forbidden passion, all wrapped in one blood-soaked cape. Victorian readers devoured it. The vampire had become the perfect monster for an age terrified of its own desires. The more civilized society became, the more it needed something dark to reflect its hidden hunger. And through literature, the vampire found immortality again, this time not in flesh, but in ink. Modern vampires. From Dracula to pop culture, immortality. The vampire may have started in graveyards, but by the 20th century it had found a new home, the silver screen. In 1922, the first cinematic vampire crawled onto film, Nosferatu, a silent German horror masterpiece. Gaunt, grotesque with long claws and rat-like teeth, Count Orlok was nothing like Stoker's suave Dracula. But thanks to a lawsuit from Bram Stoker's widow, who demanded all copies be destroyed, the film became legendary. Like its monster, Nosferatu refused to die. Then came 1931, and Bela Lugosi. With his heavy accent, hypnotic stare, and slicked-back hair, he gave Dracula a new identity, the aristocratic seducer. He made evil elegant. For the first time, audiences wanted the monster. From there, the vampire began reinventing itself with every generation. The 50s and 60s turned it into gothic romance. The 70s made it sensual and rebellious. Think Interview with the Vampire or The Hunger. And by the 2000s, vampires were glittering in high school cafeterias, attending nightclubs, or starring in brooding indie dramas. Each era got the vampire it deserved. When society feared disease, the vampire spread infection. When it feared sexuality, the vampire embodied temptation. When it feared power, the vampire became the outsider, the misunderstood anti-hero. It's a creature that survives by reflecting us. Every mirror it avoids becomes another screen, showing not its face, but ours. Because really, the vampire was never about immortality. It was about adaptation. And no myth in history has ever adapted quite like this one. Why the vampire never dies. After centuries of coffins, castles, and countless reinventions, one question remains. Why won't the vampire stay dead? The answer is simple. Because it was never really about the blood. It was always about the mirror. Every age creates its own vampire, not to drink from us, but to reflect us. When people feared the plague, vampires represented disease. When they feared outsiders, vampires were foreigners. When they feared their own desires, vampires became the beautiful monsters who seduce instead of bite. And now, in an age obsessed with youth, beauty, and online immortality, the vampire fits better than ever. We drain our screens for vitality, curate our images to live forever, and fear one thing above all, fading into obscurity. We've turned the myth into a metaphor for our digital age, always awake, always consuming, never dying. Even modern vampire stories, from Twilight to What We Do in the Shadows, show that the myth isn't about horror anymore. It's about loneliness, identity, power. It's about the ache of being alive for too long and still wanting more. So when we keep resurrecting the vampire, we're not reviving a monster. We're reviving ourselves, our anxieties, our ambitions, our hunger for meaning. The vampire doesn't die because the things it represents never die. As long as humans fear death and crave eternity, there will always be someone waiting in the dark, fangs just out of sight, whispering, "Come closer." And that, Sleepyheads, brings us to the end, or perhaps just another rebirth. Tonight, we followed the vampire from ancient graves to neon-lit cities, through fear, fascination, and desire. It's strange, isn't it? The more the world changes, the more this creature refuses to fade. Because the vampire isn't just a monster in the dark, it's a reflection of us, of our need to be seen, remembered, and endlessly alive. So as you drift to sleep, remember, some stories never die. They just find new veins. If you enjoyed wandering through the shadows with me tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let the algorithm know you're still among the living. Until next time, fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and dream gently through history.